Welcome to everyone who's just started joining. We'll just wait a couple of minutes and then we will kick off. Okay, welcome everybody. I might kick things off as people continue to join. Today we would like to welcome you to the ecologiQ Lunch and Learn. So today we're going to be hearing from Rhys Owen-Roberts, who's the Senior Manager for Sustainable Infrastructure at Major Road Programs Victoria, and myself, Polly Gourlay-Philipp. So I'm the Projects and Technical Lead at ecologiQ. And we're going to be talking about the VIDA, Victorian Infrastructure Delivery Agency's new decarbonisation strategy and what role recycled and reused materials will play in helping to decarbonise our infrastructure. So before we hear from Rhys, I'd like to do a quick acknowledgement of the traditional owners. So today I'm joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, the beautiful city of Naarm. And I always like to sort of touch on the seasons down here. So the Wurundjeri people have 7 different seasons. We're about to enter the Punit season, which is the season of the tadpoles and higher rainfalls. And we're just exiting the Gulong season, which is the season of the wattles and the flowering orchids. It's been pretty mild weather lately, so we're seeing lots of those beautiful wildflowers out and about in Melbourne. Okay, so just a quick bit of housekeeping before we kick off. So I just remind everyone to please stay muted and please use the Q&A function. So we will have lots of time for discussion and questions at the end. Rhys will be presenting on the decarb strategy and we'll be talking a little bit about ecologiQ's part in that, and then we'll be opening it up to questions. So please, keep your questions coming and we'll endeavour to answer all of those during the session. Okay, I might pass over to Rhys to take us through the decarb strategy.
Thanks, Polly. Good afternoon, everyone. As Polly mentioned, Rhys Owen-Roberts, I'm the Senior Manager, Sustainable Infrastructure for Major Road Projects Victoria, and together with Polly, one of the authors of the VIDA decarb strategy. So I'm going to run through that with you today. I'm just going to try and share my screen and hopefully this all goes to plan. Is that coming through yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, 1 second. I'll try again.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. It's always the way, isn't it? You do the test before and it works fine, and then you get into the actual thing. It's a bit different. Okay, so firstly, why do we need a decarbonisation strategy for VIDA? So as everyone will be aware, climate change poses very significant risks, not just to our environment, but also our economy and the communities that we are all part of. It is obviously, climate change is very much an intergenerational challenge, and we know that future generations by far will be bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. So we're very much faced with the challenge that we have to address now in order to mitigate those future impacts. And so to respond to that, Victoria has some fairly ambitious climate change targets. It's committed to net zero by 2045, as well as a number of interim targets. And that's in line with limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and ideally no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That's consistent, obviously, with also the Paris Agreement, which Australia is a signatory to. Now, decarbonisation of infrastructure generally, it has been identified as a priority at both a state and a national level. and decarbonisation of infrastructure sits on the Infrastructure Transport Minister's work plan at the moment. So it's been identified at that level, certainly at the Victorian level. It's also a priority as well, along with a range of other initiatives and priorities in decarbonising the transport sector. For example, transport users and transitioning to zero emissions vehicles. In terms of what does this all mean from an embodied carbon perspective? So the transport infrastructure that we have in Australia accounts for around 3% of Australia's emissions. Now that might seem minor, a small amount, but actually when you add that all up together with a whole range of other industries, it becomes a very important part. And if you want to get to net zero, the advice to government has been very clear that all sectors of our economy need to decarbonise, and it's no good us just focusing on the energy sector or transport users. The whole of our economy really needs to make this shift. Now, we're, as I mentioned there, sort of touched on, there's a number of other sectors that are very heavily involved in decarbonisation, particularly the energy grid and transport users. And so VIDA as an organisation, we are a delivery authority for transport assets. We also deliver health infrastructure as well, but this strategy is very much focused on the transport portfolio. But we develop and procure, design and deliver transport infrastructure assets. We don't operate and maintain those assets. That's the Department of Transport and Planning or other returned asset owners. And so our area of influence is very much in that construction phase, that design phase. And so we have decided to focus on what we call upfront carbon, and what is known as upfront carbon rather. And that's the carbon associated with the assets before they become operational. So it includes things like land clearing, the materials that we procure and transport to our sites, and also the energy that we use in actual construction. So the fuel and the electricity that we procure. Now, the big build in Victoria has seen a huge investment in transport infrastructure. It has very much transformed the industry. And with that, there's built a huge amount of capacity and capability. And so we know that whilst we have a responsibility, we also have the skills and the opportunities to support this transition. Now, when we look at VIDA's footprint, and again, this is about the transport infrastructure projects, our footprint is very much determined by two main factors. It's the carbon intensity of our projects and the amount of work that we do. And this is quite an important point when we start to talk about targets for VIDA, because climate legislation is based around reducing emissions towards net zero. So comparing to a baseline emissions and trying to track your way towards that end goal. Now, for us as an organisation, if we were to try and look at emissions reductions compared to what the transport sector was producing in 2005 would be very challenging, because as you can see, over time, the big build has resulted in a significant increase in the amount of work that has an associated increase in emissions. So what we've got to do is focus on the carbon intensity of our projects. Whilst the footprint of VIDA has increased over time, that's not to say that projects haven't become more carbon efficient. It's just a reflection of the volume of work that's being undertaken. Now, last financial year, we estimate VIDA's transport projects accounted for around 1.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, to put that in perspective, that's over 200,000 return flights from Melbourne to London. Or if you want to visualize it, it's about a tonne of carbon is about a hot air balloon worth of gas. So you can imagine the sky with 1.5 million hot air balloons. So that 3%, obviously a smaller proportion, but it's still a significant amount of emissions that need to be factored. Now, when we break down our upfront carbon footprint, we look at the materials and the energy, and we know that about 3/4 of our upfront carbon footprint is in the materials that we procure, and the remainder in the energy and the fuels that we burn. Now, breaking down those materials a little bit further, you can see over 80% of those, that material footprint is in steel and aluminium and concrete. Now, those distributions will vary slightly depending on the types of projects that you're looking at. This summary here is for the whole of VIDA's portfolio. For example, if we look at, say, road projects, metropolitan road projects, the asphalt becomes a much bigger component, and the aggregates will become a bigger proportion of that overall pie. Likewise, if you go to the rail sector, you'll start to see steel becoming more important. But on average, on the whole, you can see that those materials are the ones that are really sort of driving that material footprint. So to address this, we have set some targets for VIDA, and these are targets which we aim to work towards. And these are comparisons or reductions compared to a 2005 equivalent. So a lot of people in the industry will be very familiar with setting emissions reduction targets, and we do this on all of our projects to date, but compared to current day business as usual. Now, the slight change that we're making here is that we want to measure our reductions and drive a pathway towards net zero, drive a pathway to decarbonise our projects. And so we're going to do that by comparing to a fixed baseline based on assumptions around 2005. So that will take into account things like the energy grid intensity, carbon intensity in 2005, the materials that were available and the technologies. And so that's something that we'll develop and share with projects and allow them then to track towards net zero, allow us to ramp those targets up over time. These will apply from next year to capital expenditures of 50 million and above. Obviously coming into effect next year, however, a number of actions are already underway this year to really set things up. Now, in terms of how Recycle First plays a part in this and recycled materials more generally, we know that on the whole, more often than not, recycled materials will have a lower emissions than virgin materials. It's not always the case, and we do recognise that. There are some recycled materials that have very high energy inputs in terms of taking the processing required to take a product or a waste and process that into a new material can have very high energy requirements. However, as we know, the grid will decarbonise over time. A lot of those materials will become lower emissions in the future. Nevertheless, right now, there are a lot of opportunities with recycled materials. And for example, I've got some examples on the screen here. Reclaimed asphalt pavement in the road sector, very widely understood and used, but by incorporating old road into new road, effectively, you're reducing your virgin bitumen content and use. And in Victoria, we can, depending on the pavement layer, you can use up to 40% of reclaimed asphalt pavement in your design. And we have a number of some projects working in the temporary pavement space that have gone even further than that. Likewise, recycled aggregates such as concrete, crushed brick, other construction and demolition waste can be very good, well repurposed into road base, for example. I might just ask, Polly, if you want to join in here as well, because there's a number of other materials that, recycled materials that we know can help to drive down emissions. One of the ones we've been looking at recently has been void formers, for example, in concrete. Do you want to tell us a bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rhys. So I think, a really interesting example of a small business that started up in Melbourne, who were 3D printing a recycled plastic void former. So this interlocks and effectively, like a void former, sits within the concrete, and you use less concrete. So we've seen some examples of that being used on some of the level crossings projects and the North East Link projects exploring it as well, where they've, just in a slab, they've reduced the concrete volume by 24%. So you can imagine what the emissions reductions that go with that are as well.
Yeah.
And also, I think, one of the things, and you touched on, Rhys, particularly with plastic, they can be quite high emissions, the production of some of these plastic products. But I guess what we're seeing is as the demand for them increases, we obviously see more suppliers, and those suppliers are often smaller businesses. They have the opportunity to decarbonise their factories and the energy that's used to manufacture the plastic, and we're starting to see that happening, which is really exciting. And then I think the other aspect is around the sort of emissions reduction with the transport. So obviously when you're substituting a plastic pipe for a concrete pipe, or viaduct screening, it's much lighter weight. There's a lot lower transport emissions associated. So often there's a lower cost involved in that transport. Manual handling advantages as well for install, and the sort of option for more modular products as well.
Yeah. There's a number of other initiatives as well. Macro synthetic fibers, recycled plastic fibers, which, if used correctly, obviously are very good solutions to reduce your steel content in concrete, which is, a very high embodied carbon component as well. Also recycled steel. We know we've got some good suppliers in Victoria for specific uses, but, 100% recycled steel can be used in certain applications. So again, there's a number of opportunities out there where the recycled materials really play an important role in the sort of decarbonisation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point as well around, I guess, the kind of design optimization. So with recycled materials, we need to make sure that we're working with the designers to optimize the design rather than just substitute them for a virgin material.
Yeah.
And also being very selective about where we use them. So macro synthetic fibers is a good example. Very important that they're not coming out of the slab and the finish is correct, so you're not getting any runoff into the natural environment, or if they're in a particularly sensitive area, like having all those considerations at play as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that comes to the education piece, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later on. But I did want to also just touch on the ecologic program. So obviously we have the Recycle First policy in Victoria, which is looking to optimise recycled reused materials. And the policy is one thing. I think the other thing that's really important, and one of the great achievements of ecologiQ, is the program that goes around that. So the technical support and leadership, the resources, the education, things like today's Lunch and Learn, the sort of connecting suppliers with contractors and designers is it's been a really sort of transformational piece in Victoria in our industry. And I think that's definitely lessons learned for us in terms of how we can apply that more broadly to lower emissions materials and technologies moving forward. So one of the things we really want to leverage is a lot of the great work that ecologiQ have done in this space, and to apply that more broadly.
Yeah, and I think, vice versa, ecologiQ's remit has obviously been really around recycled and reused materials, but we're, more and more we're getting asked the question around what are the emissions associated. So that natural progression into understanding more about the embodied carbon associated with recycled materials. And, maybe that looks like visual guides where you can identify recycled materials, but also low carbon, because they may be hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it would be worth us just also touching on some of the other things. Now, you actually mentioned value engineering and sort of that design process. That is really important, and probably one of the things I didn't say earlier on. But whilst we're focusing on upfront carbon, whole of life carbon, we haven't chucked that out. It's still really, really important, and we still want projects to think about the whole of life. Still think about operations of assets and maintenance. It's just that our targets, specifically focus on the upfront carbon piece. But the value engineering aspect is so critical. Like, we need to identify how we can use less materials. No, that obviously reduces our emissions. It also reduces our costs. And we need to build clever, so those are the sort of that value engineering piece, which I know designers and projects do well. It's just putting that carbon lens on things, sort of extra emphasis in that space. Low carbon materials, obviously, things like low carbon concrete. I haven't sort of spoken about the use of cement replacement, for example, but there's a number of industrial byproducts that we know you can incorporate into concrete and reduce your cement use. Cement, obviously, containing clinker, which is a very carbon intensive. The production of clinker is very, very carbon intensive. So concrete, one of the reasons why concrete is such a big focus for us. So if we can replace the cement with other materials like fly ash and blast furnace slag, that you can achieve similar sort of performance outcomes. There's a number of considerations that have to be taken into account, but you can you can still achieve your requirements in concrete but have a lower carbon footprint. Looking at the steel that we use, and I mentioned before, recycled steel, or substitution, and asphalt, again, another, particularly in the road space, very important material. Not only can we incorporate recycled materials into the asphalt, there's a number of examples incorporating not just reclaimed asphalt pavement, but other recycled materials as well. But looking at how the type of asphalt that we're laying, so warm mix asphalt, but rather than hot mix asphalt, which is now a requirement in Queensland. Obviously, we're trying to do a lot more of that here in Victoria, if we can, because there's a lot less energy required to heat that. Trials of new materials is a really important part of what we do. It's certainly been a feature, I think, of the Big Build. Projects like the Level Crossing Removals Programme have really, sort of adopted this. Our roads program has done similar work, trying to identify and trial new products and new materials, whether that's concrete mixes and innovative concrete mixes or recycled materials. So that's been a feature of Big Build. It will continue to be what we support in order to facilitate this transition. And with that, goes the research into those emerging technologies. And finally, whilst it's not around materials, it's still an important part, trying to look at the renewable energy and electrification of plant and equipment. It is, as I mentioned earlier on, a quarter of that upfront carbon footprint. Solar battery systems, which are becoming more and more common on our projects, even where they are partnered with a diesel generator, we know that you can reduce the size of your generator, reduce your overall fuel burn by utilizing solar and battery combinations. Ultimately, hopefully, we get rid of the diesel generators entirely. But there's some technologies there to help us on our way. Obviously, the renewable energy grid, using drop-in renewable fuels, and we're seeing a number of projects now testing and trialing, hydro-treated vegetable oils or HVO fuels, and of course, finally, the hybrid and electrification of plant. Some very early examples coming into the Big Build and projects now, but we hope to see that sort of obviously picking up over time as those technologies improve and the supply becomes more available. So just finally, in terms of the strategy, and I think the link has been popped in the chat, so you can download the strategy and have a read in your own time. But it's important, as like the ecologiQ program, we have to support this with a number of actions. We've identified a number of actions that we'll take in terms of looking at VIDA's processes and systems, so integrating carbon into our decision making and valuing carbon. Leveraging digital engineering. There's a whole transformation project around digital engineering that's being led by the Department of Transport and Planning together with VIDA. And so we're obviously looking to how we can incorporate and work with that. Guidance and tools, and Polly mentioned earlier on, things like visual guides. ecologiQ have done, obviously produced a huge range of materials that are available on the Knowledge Hub, and we'll look to expand that to cover cover low carbon materials. Just to mention, to partnering with industry, we know that, as VIDA, we can't do this on our own. It's really going to take the whole supply chain, whether that's contractors and suppliers and designers. We've all got to work together on this. And finally, sort of a common theme here, but the training and knowledge sharing is a really, really key part of this, to really sort of give the right information to decision makers in order to be able to procure and use those lower carbon materials and technologies. So that's it from me in terms of the presentation, Polly. I'll hand back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Rhys. That was really interesting, and great to see. I know we've all been working on this for a long time, so nice to see it come into fruition now. Just a reminder to everyone online, please pop your questions in the Q&A function. I've got a couple of questions to sort of kick us off, but really keen to hear from the audience as well. The first one I had was really around, what do you see as the biggest challenges for implementing this strategy across transport? And I guess what are VIDA doing to sort of look at solutions to that?
Yeah, sure. I guess there are a number of challenges. I think the first one is, and it ties into this education piece, but it's about getting decisions made early. So considering very early on during project development, making sure those conversations are being had, during the development of the business case, but really sort of going into that project development phase, so that can carry on through to project delivery. And with that, obviously the education is a really key component to it. So we've got to, as I said before, provide the right information, the right tools to decision makers. And I think when you do that, we'll find that a lot of those missed opportunities will be captured, and we'll start to implement them more on projects. It's, there's a lot of the advancement that we need to make is actually just doing a lot more of what we're already doing. And that's been the same with recycled first. When we looked at that, the policy has actually resulted in a large increase in recycled content within existing standards and specifications. It didn't necessarily require a whole change there, although that's obviously something that's being looked at. So I think it's important that we do that. Sustainability professionals, on their own cannot drive all these outcomes. And so you've got to, you know, provide those educations and those support to their colleagues and the engineers and the, you know, the procurement teams and commercial teams that are working on projects. So I see that as a challenge, but I think, you know, as we've talked about, we're working on those tools and we're working on that guidance to support teams, and you know, the collaborative contract model that we have in Victoria, I think is a really good opportunity for us to kind of get in there and provide that support.
And I guess that's like, I guess one of my reflections with why decarbonisation is probably a slightly easier sustainability topic to address, because you can, you know, capture that data and really assess your performance. You know, other parts of sustainability are less tangible. So it's a lot more challenging to understand, or at least report up and speak to engineers about, you know, how are we progressing? You know, what do we look like now versus 5 years ago?
Yeah.
So I guess that's another big part of the strategy, is that consistency.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm seeing a couple of questions coming into the chat. I've got one or two more, but I guess the other one I was keen to sort of understand is, you know, are there any indicators around the supply chain and how they're going to respond? And also, do we see increased costs as part of this? Like, is that a realistic assumption?
Yeah, sure. I think what we've learned from Recycle First is if you provide the signals to supply chain, they will respond. But equally, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of it is about utilizing and optimizing really what is already available in the market. And we know, you know, all of the major concrete suppliers, for example, have low carbon concrete solutions that are, you know, we can utilize on our projects. So I think supply chains will respond, contractors and designers will respond given the signal, and that's what we're hoping to do with this. In terms of cost, decarbonisation won't come for free. You know, there obviously are some costs associated with that, and there's a number of, you know, pieces of research and that's out there. Infrastructure Australia recently published the national carbon values, which give you an indication of sort of, I suppose, good value carbon reduction over time. I think what you'll find when you look at those though, is that price rapidly increases as you get towards net zero. That's obviously taking a sort of a macro view at things, but what it does tell us is that, you know, if we don't invest in the low carbon technologies now, we're essentially kicking that can down the road, and we're going to be paying for it in the future. So yes, there will be some cost. That said, it's definitely not always, you know, a green premium. Let's say, you know, reducing what we build is going to cost less. Value engineering will always be, you know, a cheaper option than over engineering. And yeah, so I think there's you know, we shouldn't always assume that it's going to be, you know, a more expensive outcome. That said, we can utilize things like carbon values to really help us judge what we consider to be good value carbon reduction for any given year on our journey towards net zero. Infrastructure Australia actually also, I'm giving them a lot of shout outs today, but they recently published a report on reducing embodied carbon in infrastructure, and that looked at you know, really sort of driving down emissions through substitutions of you know, current or existing practices with lower carbon practices at really very relatively zero additional cost. So they sort of identified that as a potential opportunity. So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there just by being focused and targeted in this space.
I guess, as you noted, you know, the whole of industry and supply chain are having to decarbonise. So we'll see the cement industry having to decarbonise. So we'll see those lower carbon concrete mixes more prevalent, because they'll have to be to produce them. So I think we'll start to see, and we already are, to be honest, like we're not seeing huge premiums on those lower carbon mixes, although, you know, where the technology is newer, there's definitely still a premium involved.
Yeah, there are, and there'll be occasions where, you know, we might trial or utilize a new material and it comes at a, you know, relatively high cost, but you're doing it in small amounts to really sort of like, you know, help facilitate that technology. So the overall cost of a project might be relatively small, but those are important steps that we need to take. But yeah, things like the cement industry, obviously they're captured under the safeguard mechanism, you know, so they're faced with, you know, having to respond to that. So they'll be decarbonising in order to avoid those costs as well.
Yeah, definitely. I might hand over and we'll start going through some of the questions we're getting in the chat.
Yep.
So the first one I've got here from Tim is, how are VIDA stimulating this in contract design for projects?
Yeah, so if we're talking about business case, obviously this is something we're sharing and sort of communicating internally, and there's a range of ways that that's being done. At a national level, projects that go to Infrastructure Australia now for assessment for Commonwealth funding over 250 million have to apply carbon values and monetize carbon values. And so that requires us to actually start calculating and assessing carbon very early on in the business case and featuring that into our optioneering. So that obviously trickles through into the designs as well. There's in principle agreement to apply that to 100 million in funding from next year. So I think we'll start to see the business case space really start considering carbon. As we move into contracts and project development, obviously we have the incentives through our contracts, and for MRPV, as an example, those incentives apply to both the designer and the contractor. So there's a reward there for actually designing and delivering lower carbon designs and projects. So I think we'll start to see it there, but ultimately it will be in our contracts.
And I guess we'd love to say that we'll sort of follow in the footsteps of National Highways and some of the tenders where they're setting, a carbon baseline and then asking tenderers to come back and tell them how they're going to reduce that.
Yeah.
Where we want to get to, I guess.
I think, yeah, that would be a great place for us to get to, definitely. And I think when we were looking at how we set targets, one of the things we did consider was, do we start to look at carbon budgets and how do we approach that? I think we've got a little bit of work to do, I think, in terms of our systems and the maturity of our systems in Victoria before we can get to that. I think there's a risk when you set carbon budgets, there's a risk that you're doing that with limited information early on. You may then overinflate your expectation or your baseline, in which case you end up widening the goalposts effectively. So I think you have to be careful with that. The good thing about this targets and these strategies is that we're utilizing existing methodologies that projects have already familiar with, designers and contractors, the development of a baseline, using certain assumptions, but developing a baseline and then developing a baseline at the end, at the as-built, and comparing the difference. So it's not a huge shift for industry in that respect.
Yeah, and I think that leads on nicely to the next question from Andrew, which I'm very glad he asked, which is around, in practice, how does VIDA envisage the 2005 project equivalent baseline to be calculated?
Yep.
And will VIDA be defining those set of BAU assumptions?
Yeah. Yes, so we will, which is not that different from how we operate now anyway. All of our project offices have what we consider to be our current business as usual assumptions, and we provide those to contractors and designers. We'll be doing the same exercise, but with the 2005 assumptions. And obviously the goal around this is harmonizing and standardizing that approach. So yeah, ideally we will set those, and there'll be very limited need to change or negotiate those, although obviously projects are unique things, and there may be examples which we consider on a project by project basis. But yes, we'll do that work up front, so that projects have that. We'll also do the work around establishing the process or the procedure around the emissions reduction as well, so that we have a harmonized or consistent approach to the calculation as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, so that for all of our supply chain, it's consistent depending on what project office they're working for.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a reflection, I guess, on the big build. We've had these very big programs of work, which have necessitated their own project offices, and they've had their own. We've all had our own sort of ways of doing things slightly. So, there has been a little bit of variability between project offices, but what we're doing with this work is really trying to sort of bring that consistency. So you can go from a level crossing project to a major road project, and you'll have a very similar approach.
Yeah, and I think that's probably really what kicked off this piece of work 14 months ago, was that piece around we're all doing effectively the same thing in a slightly different way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Great. So next question I've got here is around quality and product life and whether that's being considered. I think I can touch on that briefly from a recycled material perspective, just to say that, where recycled materials are substituted for a virgin, they have to meet the same design requirements, the Vic Road spec or whatever the design requirements are. Now, often we're actually finding that supplementing things like reclaimed asphalt with crumb rubber can lead to a longer design life for that paving. So, it's definitely considered and it's part of it from a recycled materials perspective. But yeah, I don't know, Rhys, if you want to add to that from a decarb.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, whole of life is important. We don't want to be utilizing low carbon materials for the sake of a reduced upfront carbon outcome, only to then have to replace that material, within its design life because it's failed or because it hasn't met the requirements. So that's absolutely, that's not a great outcome at all. So durability is still really important. Meeting the design life and the requirements of the return asset owner. We're not sacrificing those things. Low carbon concrete, it's not we're not using concrete that's going to fail the durability requirements, for example. We can replace cement and do these low carbon mixes that still meet the performance that we need to do. So that's absolutely.
And I think if anything, the lower carbon and recycled materials probably come under more scrutiny than the virgin material equivalents because of that, because DTP and the asset owners, for understandable reasons, want to make sure that they're not going to have to be maintaining them at a more frequent rate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there is a certain amount, I guess, of maybe some preconceived ideas that these materials will be inferior. I think it's on us to make sure that we're not using inferior materials or mixed designs. We're using something that is fit for purpose.
I'll come back. There's a question from Kerry, but there's another question around recycled materials and having higher emissions, and will guidance be given recommending not to use them? I can start probably by answering that, and I think I touched on it earlier. With a lot of the kind of new innovative recycled materials, as Rhys mentioned, we do see that either we don't have the data to understand what the emissions associated with them are, which means we'll be pushing more to see EPDs and life cycle assessments carried out so that we can actually look at how we can reduce the embodied carbon associated. So we won't be saying don't use them. We just want to make sure that the suppliers are doing everything they can to further decarbonise the manufacturing. But I think the kind of biggest challenge with recycled materials is we don't have that data, particularly for some of the smaller suppliers and prefabricated units. We don't have EPDs necessarily for them, so we won't be providing guidance not to use them. If anything, it's the other end, where if we see more uptake, we start to see more competition, price gets driven down, and then suppliers are in a position where they can invest in putting solar panels on their factories and decarbonising the manufacturing process.
Yep.
Okay, I've got another question here from Kerry. So that's that, given that design can contribute significantly, how will this be given more time and space to develop well-integrated and optimised designs?
Well, I suppose from our perspective at MRPV, our model might differ slightly from some of the other project offices. We don't have alliances like level crossing removals do, but we do have an interactive and collaborative process. I'm working very closely with our teams to sort of identify and incorporate these things into the development of reference designs. But yeah, absolutely, you do need to give the time and to design, and the question and the comment is spot on, that the design is really important to this. And again, that's why not only we have in MRPV's contracts, we have a sustainability design process which really helps to set out and identify how this is being addressed, and moving into delivery, the incentives that we put are very clearly for the designer as well as the contractor. So there's an incentive there to make sure the designers are considering this and driving that outcome for a project.
I think this comes back to the sort of training and accountability. It's, you know, it's got to be like safety. Everyone's going to be accountable for this in their job role in some form or function. And I think what we often see with the big projects is by the time, you know, the contract's awarded and they go into detailed design, a lot of those decisions have been made during the reference design, particularly in rail, where you have quite a refined reference design often. So it's really that education piece for those design teams, because often designers will just continue using materials that they've always used, that they, you know are the right material. So it is really that, you know, awareness training. There are other materials. There's other, you know, that optimized design that you can use by supplementing in a recycled or lower carbon material.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's you know, there's often two designers that, you know, involved in a project. You know, you've got a sort of your client side technical advisor who may do a fair bit of optimization, and I think we can't ignore or forget that. I think it's important that we still capture that, and it's probably something we haven't really done well enough in the past to really identify all the sort of the good things that have been incorporated into a design once, you know, before you get to that procurement phase. So I think that's, you know, another thing that we'll be looking at closely.
And making sure, that we're not working in silos and sharing those, you know, good outcomes across the portfolio.
Yeah.
Next question I've got here from Tony is there an approach to standardized specifications in areas like, as an example, footpaths, where we have numerous different specifications with local governments using the same type of pavements, which means suppliers with new products have to go through the approval process, which is pretty challenging. I think, both Rhys and I can I guess we hear this on the projects, and we've done quite a bit of work through the low carbon working group around trying to get a consistent approval process for low carbon and recycled materials, because it is really challenging. I think Victoria's, you know, quite unique in the way we have a lot of different standards and specifications. And, you know, Rhys, I'm sure you've got more to add to this, but there is a piece of work going on to try and standardise through Ausroads to get a sort of standard approach to specifications, which will be fantastic. But I'll let you jump in.
I hear the point in terms of, you know, say between council or public transport and planning, or you know, the rail sector. I acknowledge that challenge. I think it's we can't shy away from it. We don't have an immediate solution, but it is certainly acknowledged, and one of the things that we're, you know, sort of working on in terms of our consultation with those returned asset owners.
And I think, just something that's constantly being escalated, because we note that it is causing, you know, I guess it's unfair for a lot of the smaller players in the field as well, who don't have the resources and money and experience that some of the bigger players do.
Yeah, that's true. I think return asset owners can come under, you know, they can sort of get a bit of a negative view on this in terms of the standards and specifications are limiting what we can do, and I think that's it's often unfair. You know, councils can be very progressive, and you know, there's a lot of really good opportunities that have been done on council returned assets, and equally Department of Transport and Planning. You know, when we look at, say, concrete, we know that we can, even within the existing standards, you know, you can submit non-conforming concrete mix designs for approval. But, you know, and they have done that. There's numerous concrete mixes out there that are approved that sit outside of the spec. So I think it's, one of the things we have to do is learn to work with the processes that we have to get these outcomes.
Okay, I think lucky last, and this is a good one to finish on. So from Kerry, I've got here, would it be terrible to have lower carbon solutions that are not as durable, given that once they're replaced, the likelihood is the options will then be improved solutions, given emissions now are more impactful on a 2050 warming potential than future emissions?
Oh, is that hedging your bets, is it?
Depends who we're speaking to.
I don't know. I guess I think you can't guarantee that, I suppose, at the end of the day. I think we have to, and you don't know which way that's going to go. I think we have to look at, you have to consider whole of life at the end of the day, I think. And maybe there'll be some examples and circumstances where you're prepared to sacrifice something on that basis. Although I think, you definitely have to do it on a case-by-case basis. I don't think we'd apply that holistically. But it's an interesting view and point, I suppose.
And I think, a real challenge, particularly in the recycled and I'm sure low carbon materials space, is these products haven't been out in the environment for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So when you get asked by an asset owner, how's it going to perform in 50 years? Or I want a trial for 20 years. That's obviously not going to be suitable. We're going to, miss out if we take that approach. Lucky last, and I think we'll then have to call it, but it's a good question. So from Thomas, I've got one around industry scale mass balance. Has that been conducted to understand if the supply of recycled materials will be able to keep up with increased demand? As an example of things like fly ash decreasing, crushed concrete demand increasing, and RAP increasing.
Well, I know, and you can probably talk to ecologiQ supply map and the demand mapping that's been done. I think the fly ash is a very interesting one. We know that fly ash and blast furnace slag are byproducts of carbon intensive industries, particularly fly ash, sort of as a byproduct of coal burning for power, which will ultimately have a finite life as we decarbonize the grid and as the steel industry decarbonizes as well. I think there's probably enough supply right now, to keep us going for the next couple of decades at least. But we do have to look to that future, and so there is a lot of work going on in this space. I know Cement Australia have, some plans around that they've been talking to us about how they're going to, transition away from existing supplementary cementitious materials and identify new ones. We've got a number of projects that are looking into calcined clay as an example, as an alternative cement replacement. So there is that piece of work going on. In terms of the recycled material supply, I know you guys have been doing that mapping and the supply and demand models. And
I think it's actually, it creates a really exciting opportunity because, for instance, we had a roundtable yesterday on recycled and reused ballast. Now there's huge stockpiles of ballast sitting around the network that are not being used, and it's a fantastic material that could be going into concrete, can be used for hard standing, aggregate replacement. So I think the demand for some of these recycled materials is going to increase because there will be a shortage, whether it's virgin or recycled. It also brings that cost competitiveness down, which is exciting to see. I think I'm going to have to wrap up because I know we've probably run over by a few minutes, but I'd really like to thank Rhys for his time today. Really interesting to hear and some good discussion, and excited to see how the actions that come out of the strategy unfold. And just to let everyone know, the session will be up on the ecologiQ YouTube channel. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out. I'm sure Rhys and I can answer your questions offline as well. But thank you. Thanks everyone, and have a good rest of the Friday.